Picture this scene. You are in a Central European forest. You found a small clearing and have circled your wagons up around a campfire. The snow dampens all sound, but you would still hear the Teutonic cavalry approaching from a long ways off. As you start to warm up in your little encampment, buffeted from the winds by your wagons, you start to ask yourself, what's for dinner? Food is arguably the most important resource in Age of Empires 2, but all we see in game is just a single set of resources. Throughout this series, we will be diving in to see exactly what foods each civilization prepared and ate, and how well I can recreate these recipes. This is Meals of Empires. Today we will be looking at the foods of Bohemia, that is the western portion of what is now the Czech Republic or Czechia. Bohemian medieval history starts with the mixing of Germanic and Slavic cultures. You have a Slavic empire that starts with Great Moravia, which is just to the east of the Bohemians, but of course during that time period borders weren't as fixed, and that began the process of translating religious texts into Old Slavic and the developing of what will be Cyrillic in the future. Following that, you have the Carolingian Empire, known as the Franks in Age of Empires 2, forming ties with the Bohemians. So the Bohemians went from Eastern Slavic influences to a more Western influence of the Franks. And then once the Holy Roman Empire came about, Bohemians were one of those founding provinces. So the main period represented in Age of Empires 2 is the period in the 1400s, late medieval period, high medieval period, known as the Hussite Wars, which was due to religious reformation, differences in what people thought Christianity really stood for. And we'll get to that later in the trivia question. But getting back to the food, the three dishes we have are Staročeský Houbovy Kuba, that's a mouthful, roughly translates to Old Bohemian mushroom stew. Google Translate says mushroom cube, but that's just a mistranslation of Cuba. We'll get to that in a little bit. We have braised cabbage, and we have a strawberry compote, and I'll touch on all of those as we begin cooking, but let's go ahead and start. So we're going to start with the Houbovy Kuba, and the main principal ingredient is barley. So these are barley groats is what they're called. So this is the barley once it's had the awns, the palia, and all these other botany terms for the outer, like papery leaf-like structures. So you just have what some people might call the grain or the kernel. But these are pearled barley in that they've also had the bran, the slightly brown outer coating, also removed to allow it to cook much, much faster. So this is called pearled barley. We're going to use about 400 grams, which is about a cup, I believe, or a cup and a half is closer to 400 grams. And we're going to cook it just like rice. This dish almost comes out a little bit like a risotto. Not quite. You'll see the variations as we come to it. So we're going to use about 400 grams and a 2-to-1 ratio of water, just as if we were cooking rice. And we can cook that in our large pot and get that started all on its own. While that's going, we can start working on our cabbage. The first part of braising the cabbage is going to be making the broth for the cabbage, which we'll be making in that small little pot. So I'll leave the cabbage alone for now. The broth is going to be a combination of onions and carrots to get a lot of these wonderful flavors, and it's going to be well salted to make sure that we get a lot of those flavors really like activated, enhanced, so to speak. Staročeský Houbovy Kuba is translated literally by Google Translate as Old Bohemian Mushroom Cube. So it's taking Kuba and thinking it's cube. Kuba is the short familiar name for Jacob. And there's a few different dishes named after Jacob. There's a Swedish dish comprised of bananas, peanuts, curry powder, mango chutney, chicken, and bacon, which is supposedly ingredients that were brought back by a Swedish man named Jacob by plane and mixed into a casserole. Not really what we're going for here. The other dishes named after Jacob are using Jacob from the Genesis as the reference, which Genesis being the first book in the Old Testament and the Torah. The story is that Jacob gave soup to his brother, who was very hungry, in exchange for birthright as firstborn. And the stew is widely interpreted as being a lentil stew that was colored red. And I could see Houbovy Kuba as being made with lentils instead of the barley. But other than that, I think there's been some changes over time as to why this is named after Jacob. And maybe someone who's more familiar with the dish can tell me in the comments. I'm just going to do 2 carrots. I'm going to wash them, and then I'm going to grate them. I want them as small as possible to really get immersed into the broth. Onions are coming along well, browning nicely. They smell fantastic already. We're not going to be adding any garlic to the broth for the cabbage, just because I want to not put garlic in all of the meals, the recipes. The onion's still looking a little bit green. I want it to come a little bit more translucent before I add the carrots and lower the temperature. The other main ingredient in the Houbovy Kuba is mushrooms. Here we have 2 different mushrooms. These orange ones are the chanterelles or chanterelles. The chanterelles come in a variety of different colors, roughly similar to this, but as opposed to a lot of mushrooms that have gills that are much finer than these are quite wide and thick as far as gills are. These are more just called folds rather than true gills. That's one of the defining characteristics of chanterelles. Otherwise, it is like this more golden color that you see here. These, however, are new to me. I don't know if it's going to be able to be picked up by camera because it's fairly small. These are called hedgehogs in French, and how they're referred to in Europe is pied de mouton, which directly translates to sheep's foot. But they have, the reason they're called hedgehog as well in English is because instead of gills on these, they have little spikes that protrude from the bottom of the mushroom body. And these are going to be a little bit sweeter, I believe, though I haven't tried them before. So I'm excited to have both of those in our Houbovy Kuba. So with these mushrooms, you could either put them in whole, or what we're going to do is just dice them up into cubes, whatever shape and size works for whatever piece of mushroom we have. These are all wild picked, and I collected them at the market. If you want to try to collect mushrooms yourself or learn the process, I would suggest at least starting with iNaturalist, which is a free website online where you can see where other people have observed different organisms, whether it be that plants or animals. And usually it's focusing on things that are in the wild, like people aren't posting their dogs or their cats. It's not really, that's not what it's focused on. But you can look up what you've taken a picture of. Say you've taken a picture of a mushroom, but you don't even know where to start with figuring out what species it is. You can upload a picture to the upload an observation portion of the website. There's also a great, fantastic app that goes along with it. And through like image recognition and machine learning, it will tell you what it possibly could be. And then from there, you can also look at the similar species tab of whatever suggestions it gives you. And then you have a very good idea of at least a starting point for what you could be looking at. From there, you can use the Explore page on iNaturalist to find other observations in your area. You can refine or expand the area range to places that have similar habitat. So say you were looking in a forest with a lot of deciduous trees, you might expand your area based off what you know your surrounding habitat to be, to only include the forest with deciduous trees that specific mushroom might grow around. For a place like Bohemia that has relatively uniform habitats, I could search for chanterelle observations, and I would find that there have been 317 observations and over 5 different species. Our barley groats are done with their 20 minutes of cooking. They look pretty good, pretty full of water. Obviously don't have much flavor to them yet. Let's give them a little taste. The texture is a touch chewier than rice, maybe a little bit nutty. It's really hard to really get that nuttiness. Once we add salt, more of those flavors will develop, and of course we're going to be adding plenty of ingredients. For now, I can just get them out of the pot, and then we're going to reuse the pot to start with our aromatics, followed by our mushrooms. So to start our aromatics, again, I'll add some olive oil, and then I can add our onions. So we have 4 cloves of garlic that will go in with our Houbovy Kuba. I'm curious how many people think about Age of Empires 2 while they're cooking, or what they daydream about. Or maybe you listen to Age of Empires 2 content while you're cooking. We're going to wait a few minutes while the garlic and onions really start to mingle and mix. Our main spice outside of the aromatics, I guess it's not a spice, it's an herb, is marjoram, which is very closely related to oregano. It has maybe a slightly more citrusy flavor, and when it's fresh, it can almost just be overpowering. But here we just have some dried leaves We're going to sprinkle on about a tablespoon, which should be about 2 grams, maybe a touch more. That should look pretty good, both in terms of the color and the flavor it's going to bring to our dish. And I can smell it. I don't know how to describe it. It's just like a slightly different type of floral from oregano, and a little bit less spicy on the tongue. Doesn't have that little bite. All right, it is mushroom time. Chanterelle is going in first, and they add plenty of moisture to this dish, as well as chewiness that'll pair very well with the chewiness of the barley groats. So we want to keep cooking the mushrooms until they kind of deform in terms of their shape. It's hard to really describe that without really experiencing it. Eventually, the structure of the mushroom kind of breaks apart and it's more wiggly. So yeah, once the mushroom becomes wiggly, those are my official instructions for the recipe. Once the mushroom becomes wiggly, then you're ready to add the barley just to mix it up, and then it's going to go into the oven. But the first thing that's going to be going into the oven is, of course, our cabbage. Our broth's almost ready, so we can get our cabbage ready. I'm just going to remove this outer leaf. We want to divide our cabbage roughly evenly, and this is the container I'm going to be using. So, I mean, it'll fit a few different ways. I think the best way is to cut it up into 4 or 6 pieces, depending on the size of your cabbage. This is a slightly smaller one, and it's a spiral variety. And just take up a little off the bottom. And then for the rest, I'm just going to keep the core in there because it'll help it, each individual piece stay together while it's slowly getting braised in the oven. So that's about the best I can fit in there. And then we're going to pour our broth. We're going to add the olive oil first. That way it'll coat the sides of the pan as well. We can pour it around. And then we can pour our broth right on top of it, and we'll add in all of the little bits of carrot as well, bits of carrot and onion. There's an interesting floral combination going on, and it's part of the majorum and the pied de mouton, the hedgehog mushroom, which has a slightly sweet flavor to it, which is very unlike most other mushrooms. But you can see the mushroom has kind of lost a little bit of its shape. It has become, I mean, this is a very small piece, so it's hard to show, but it has become wiggly. That's the official culinary term. And it is now time to add in our barley again. You can see barley is very closely related to wheat, but much harder to find than wheat in the grocery store. I had to visit 3 or 4 different stores, and then of course the Turkish grocer had some. Turkish grocer has been the most reliable for finding the different ingredients I've needed for this series. But I imagine like at a health food store, you might have a chance of finding barley. So the oven is heated up to 160 degrees Celsius, which is about 320 Fahrenheit. And this is going to get covered and put in the oven for about an hour, just to allow it to slowly cook and allow the juices and the flavor to slowly be incorporated up into the cabbage as it slowly falls apart into a nice tender meal. If you think back to our setting in a little clearing in a Central European forest at night, where we might just have a little wood stove in our wagon that we can cook our food on. Or we just allow the fire to simmer down and then we put our pot directly in the fire, and that's what allows us to cook our cabbage in a little pot. First trivia question. What beverage found in Bohemian religious ceremonies was one of the reasons that led to the execution of Jan Hus on grounds of heresy? I will remind you that Jan Hus is who the Hussite Wars is named after. The Hussites were his followers. So take a moment to think about that. The beverage was holy wine, not your everyday wine, but specifically wine that's used in communion. And I believe I've mentioned this before when we covered the Teutons, but the Bohemians had a different view of what should be included in communion and who should be able to get both the bread that represents the body of Christ and the wine that represents the blood of Christ. They believe that everyone should be able to take part in that process, where as the Holy Roman Empire, the Teutons, as represented in Age of Empires 2, felt that the wine should be reserved for the higher echelons of the church. And so that and other religious reformation practices led to Jan Hus being executed. And he was a major both political, religious figure and member of the academia at that time. And that led to the Hussite Wars, the Hussites being the followers of Jan Hus. So I guess it'd be Hussites. I'm not sure exactly on the pronunciation there. Second trivia question. What does the German phrase Wagenburg mean in English? Wagenburg referring to the technology in castle age for the Bohemians called Wagenburg tactics. What does that refer to in English, or what does that translate to in English? Wagenburg means wagon fortress, so this is in reference to the Hussite wagon, the unique unit of the Bohemians, forming a defensive structure where you have the wagons on the outside, and this would be represented in Age of Empires 2 by the box formation. And in the United States, there's a similar expression of circling your wagons. So circle the wagons, which means to have a united front. This comes from the period of pioneering and exploration during the 1800s in the United States, where many people were migrating further west into the landmass. And there's also similar expressions that shouldn't be confused with circling the wagon, like let's circle back to that, which has nothing to do with wagons or moving, and it just means to hold that thought or to put a pin in it. There's a similar expression that has a bit more to do with the Hussite reforms, or so it would seem, because the expression is to fall off the wagon. But what that means is to start drinking again after a period of inhibition. But the Hussites were already drinking, they were already on the wagon. So for them to fall off the wagon, and that would mean that they weren't part of the Hussite group, they were part of the Teuton group, and then they would be stopping drinking, which is the opposite of starting drinking again. All right, moving back to the Houbovy Kuba, I'm going to now put it all into this baking dish, and we're going to put it in the oven. This is about the biggest dish I can get in there while the cabbage is still cooking as well. And what cooking it in the oven will do is give it a nice crispy edge at the top. Almost the exact opposite of the tadish that we made for the Persians, where instead of the bottom being crispy from the pan, we're going to have the top crispy from its exposure in the oven. So our Houbovy Kuba will go into the oven at the same temperature our cabbage is cooking at right now for about 15 minutes. And I'll just put it on the top rack above the cabbage so we can get nice and crispy layer right at the top. While those are cooking in the oven, I'm going to start on our strawberry compote. I'm using the French pronunciation there because I don't really know how it's pronounced in English. Compote, maybe? It's very similar to an applesauce. I'm just going to avoid saying it as much as possible. Similar to an applesauce, just using any other fruit instead. Here we're going to be using strawberries, which would have grown in the understory of many forests in Central Europe. We're going to go for the smallest strawberries we can find because I find those are the most flavorful. The Fragaria vesca, I believe, is the genus of the European woodland strawberry. And these are about the closest as I could find. This time of year, they're somewhat limited. They're more readily available in late summer, early fall. Strawberries are easy to propagate as they form runners, which are horizontal stems that develop into clones. So what you'll have is the main strawberry plant, and then a little runner off to the one side just above the ground, and then at the end of that runner, a new plant will form with leaves and then eventually flowers. So it's a great way for the strawberry to gain a lot of ground in the forest without having to go through the whole flowering cycle and into seed, and allow it to find areas of light that are filtering through the leaves of the canopy. So there is 2/3 of the strawberries that I had. It's about 2 cups worth, I would say. So about 400 grams of strawberries, maybe a little bit closer to 500 grams. And we're going to add those into the small pot, as well as some honey. Of course, honey is not vegan, but you can make a trade for agave syrup. You're trading the historical accuracy for something that is vegan. Though you have to watch out with agave syrup, because bats rely on the agave flowers as a nectar resource, as a food. And when you collect agave syrup, you are cutting off the agave before it's allowed to flower, and therefore the bats are limited in their food supply. While the compote is warming up, we can do our third trivia question. What mineral mined extensively in Bohemia in the late medieval period likely led to their economic bonus in-game of having free mining upgrades? The mining activity revolved around silver, so not a resource that's present in-game in Age of Empires 2, but a similar mineral that was very useful. The 47th element on the periodic table was mined extensively in the royal town of Kutna Hora, and in the 1300s they made Prague grochens. I think that's pronunciation's decent, also called Prague pennies, and that money supply allowed the change from feudalism into a more capitalist economy where you had people buying foods and services rather than relying on serfs to do a lot of the agrarian farm work and then repaying them in the food that they were producing, supporting like the manor house that kind of covered and governed the surrounding area. So we can see that our strawberries are sweating, relieving themselves of their water, and forming a liquid that they can cook in, slightly red. But this is a good time for me to add in my honey. We're adding about 2 tablespoons, and I'm just going to judge this by eye instead of measuring out because honey is, of course, very sticky. And this is very cold honey since it's a cold winter night. You can imagine this was just sitting in the wagon, having been collected off of bees, a beehive that the wagons passed earlier, a few days ago. And they warm it back up on the stove. Honey, of course, being the readily available sweetener during that time period. You do want to stir the compote fairly regularly to make sure that it doesn't stick, but this is looking pretty good. We could add more liquid if it was needed, but I think this is looking pretty good. In fact, I'm going to turn it up a touch just to allow it to burn off a bit more liquid so we get a bit more of a syrupy sauce out of this. The word for compote, the etymology for it, comes from compost. Obviously, one of those words is far more appetizing than the other. I mean, for one of them, my mouth just waters just thinking of that rich soil. The concept of Bohemianism as a traveling creative person originated in France during the late 1400s. It was generally used in reference to the Roma or Romani people, also called by the exonym Gypsies, who did not originate from Bohemia, but actually northwestern India. The Roma left India more or less together in the 500s and reached the Balkans, Bulgaria, Eastern Mediterranean around the 1100s. The French may have made the connection between the Roma and actual Bohemians who had been previously traveling west either during the Hussite Wars that started in 1419 or a previous wave of immigrants fleeing the Mongol invasion of Europe in 1241. All right, Abby. We have everything plated and we're ready to get you tasting on some wonderful Bohemian food. Braised cabbage, we have onions and carrots forming a little bit of that broth, which is what you see on the backside of this cabbage. It's almost like a mountain range the way I've presented it here. Then we have the Staročeský Houbovy Kuba. I definitely didn't have to look that up right now. That is composed of, majority of it is barley. And then we have 2 different types of mushrooms from the market that I'm hoping are just as amazing as I imagine they will be. And then to round it all off for dessert, we have our strawberry compote, just strawberry and honey, nothing else than that. Bon appétit.
You're supposed to put compote on something, right?
You can, but you can also just eat it separate, almost like it's yogurt.
Flavors are good.
Mm-hmm.
It's well salted.
Mm-hmm.
I would eat a second bite.
Okay.
A little bitter?
You think maybe the cabbage bitterness?
I don't know.
Because
But it's not awful.
Okay. The texture, a little weird, and like the composition.
I don't mind the texture.
No? Okay. I think it might have. I'll let you judge it, and then I'll say my points later.
Whatever. Good at first.
Mm-hmm.
And then there wasn't any salt, and then it feels like something's not cooked thoroughly enough.
Okay. I think.
Or maybe it's the barley that's not cooked.
I think the barley stays very chewy. I think I could have cooked it maybe a little bit longer.
It feels chewy and crunchy.
The crunchiness is because it went into the oven at the end. So it got a little bit extra crunch.
That's not... I don't know. Yeah, I guess.
I was mentioning barley is not like the most common ingredient. You were with me as we were trying to find it in the grocery store, and it took a while just to find it. So
it is very chewy.
There might be a reason why barley isn't readily available anymore, because it's not as appealing as other grains like rice or wheat.
That's good, actually.
Yeah? Sweet?
Like, it's not like other compotes where it's like
tart?
So sweet that
Yeah.
I want to die.
That you need something else just to like balance out how sweet it is.
Okay.
Ready for the rating?
Mm-hmm.
Execution?
8.
8. Okay. I feel like we've had a string of 8s. So apparently I've been cooking decent. You mentioned that this was dry and you think a little bit undercooked as the main points against
Not impressive.
Yeah.
Not salty.
So this Houbovy Kuba is the recipe that's lasted all the way up to this time. It's often cooked as your Christmas lunch meal.
But is it cooked well enough?
Cooked as your Christmas lunch meal because you're not allowed to eat meat until later in the day.
But is it cooked well enough?
Because even if I cook it longer, it's not going to get any more moist. So it does feel like you almost need something to go on top of it. Unless I'm missing something. Get in the comments if I'm missing something.
And this was quite okay.
Quite okay.
Yeah. Like I would eat
it
more
was
of
right
this.
on that okay mark.
Yeah,
It was very okay.
I'd eat more of it.
On a should you serve this to your girlfriend scale?
I wouldn't eat that unless I were desperate.
And the compote on its own isn't really a meal.
Right. And this was fine. 6.5?
6.5 on should you serve this to your girlfriend. Okay. Thank you, Abby.
You're welcome.
Is going for another bite though. Promising sign. I think both the cabbage and the Houbovy Kuba could be cooked longer. I think it would allow it to break down. Maybe these are just my French sensibilities coming out, but I do like things fairly well cooked. As far as the cabbage, I want it to be a little bit more tender, just kind of falling apart in my mouth. And the Houbovy Kuba, I need another try. The Houbovy Kuba, after another taste, I think is perfect, but it's also more the type of meal that I like, which is just really hearty. I think barley is out of favor in modern times just because it's such a chewy crop. It could be cooked longer to help break it down a little bit better, make it less chewy. But I really like the mushroom flavors. I'm having trouble picking out exactly which flavor comes from which mushroom, but after a little bit more experimentation, I'll get a better idea in my head of where all these flavors are coming into contact. That's it for the Bohemians. Next week will be the Georgians. We'll be going a little bit further south, a little bit further east, and I have 3 fantastic recipes ready for that. So subscribe, like if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the comments.